What do the polio vaccine, outer space, chemotherapy, cloning, gene mapping, in vitro fertilization, and the birth of the biomedical industry have in common? Well, that's what we're going to find out in this episode. Welcome to the Learning Out Loud podcast. Think of it as a weekly conversation with your nerdy friend, which would be me, Katie, who is excited to share the latest nerdy things she learned about. The conversations range from history and science to personal growth and purpose, but in a non-boring way, trust me. But that's enough of the intro jibber-jabber. Let's get back into today's episode. I'm so excited for this week's episode because it combines history and science, which are two of my favorite things. So do you know what the polio vaccine, space, chemotherapy, and the birth of the biomedical industry all have in common? I'll give you a Dora the Explorer pause to answer out loud if you want to. Sí, es correcto. If you said Henrietta Lacks, you are correct. So how could one woman be a part of so many scientific discoveries, inventions, and biotechnological advancements? Was she a scientist, a professor, an inventor? No, she was not any of these things. So who was she? She was a woman in her early 30s in the 1950s who had cervical cancer. Her tumor cells were taken without her consent or knowledge and grown in a lab, and they became the first immortal human cell line. If you're in the biotech world or follow science at all, you may have heard of HeLa cells, spelled HeLa, which actually comes from the combination of her name, which is the first two letters of Henrietta and the first two letters of Lacks. This is a tragically fascinating story about science, race, class, and ethics. And coincidentally, there is a recent update to this story with regards to Henrietta's family seeking justice for the unauthorized use and profit of her cells. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll start off with how I first came across this story. This was when I found and then read the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot a few years ago. It's a really good read, and it goes way more in depth about what we're going to be talking about today. So I highly recommend reading this if you are interested at all from this episode and want to learn more about it. So Rebecca Skloot, the author, weaves the story of Henrietta and her family with her own journey in meeting the family and actually writing the book. She also dives into the topics of medical consent and some recent history around medical specimens and who the courts have decided that those belong to. And spoiler alert, it's not the human from whence they came. And yes, I did just use the word whence. There's also a movie by the same name that stars Oprah and Rose Byrne from Bridesmaids. And yes, I have seen that. All right, so I think it's time we get into it. But first, all my sources will be listed in the show notes, which you can find a link to in the episode description. So part 1, who was Henrietta Lacks? She was born by the name of Loretta Pleasant on August 1st, 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia. Her mother died when she was only 4 and was sent to live with her grandfather and cousin. They lived in a log cabin that was used as slave quarters on a white ancestor's plantation. She had her first child at 14 with her cousin that she lived with, David Lacks. They got married in 1941 and had 5 children and moved to Maryland. Her family says that she loved to cook and dance and said that she was also very stylish and was known to wear red lipstick and red nail polish. Her home was always the center for her friends and family, and she always was helping out family members and friends when they were in need. When she was only 31 years old, she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. It was a very aggressive type of cancer, and within a few months, she had tumors on most of her organs. She was treated at the public ward of Johns Hopkins because it was one of the few places in that area that treated Black people. According to the NPR.com article, she received the standard care for cervical cancer at that time. Trigger warning for graphic medical stuff coming up right now. The standard of care for cervical cancer at that time was sewing radium rods, which are a radioactive element, to her cervix and then sending her home. She would go back to Johns Hopkins and complain of pain, but they essentially ignored her until one day the pain was so bad that she actually refused to leave the hospital until she was admitted. Tragically, after a few months from her original diagnosis, she passed away. While she was being treated, the doctors took samples of her tumor without her consent or knowledge and grew them in a lab. The researchers found that Henrietta's cells could reproduce at an extremely fast rate and appeared to never die. So therefore, they were the first immortal human cell line. And her own family would not know or hear about this for the next 25 years. Part 2. So what was going on in the science world at this time in terms of immortal cell lines? And what was the scientific context for this time? So first off, I just wanted to give a little quick timeline on cell culture. So here we go. An English physiologist named Sidney Ringer in the 1800s first proved that tissues and cells can be maintained outside of the body by maintaining isolated animal hearts in salt solutions. And then in 1885, Wilhelm Roe was the first to establish cell culturing principles for growing animal cells by removing and maintaining a portion of the medullary plate of an embryonic chicken in warm saline solution. And then from 1907 to 1910, Ross Granville Harrison published his experiments, further establishing the methodology for tissue culture. In terms of Johns Hopkins, they do claim that the doctor who took Henrietta's cells, a man by the name of Dr. Gay, that he nor the university ever made any money from the distribution of HeLa cells, and that he gave them away to colleagues and other labs for free. So I just wanted to say that now, because that will come into context later. I also thought it was really important to kind of give some social context for this time. Again, this could be a whole separate series of episodes, and we can dive into that later if y'all want. But just a little brief summary of what the time period was like. According to Johns Hopkins and author Rebecca Skloot, Henrietta's treatment was standard care for the time period. But I would argue that because Henrietta was a poor Black woman in the South in the 1940s and 50s when she was sick, she probably did not receive the best care available. It was documented that Henrietta kept going back to Johns Hopkins, telling the doctors how much pain she was in, but she was ignored and told to go home. And it wasn't until she refused to leave that they finally admitted her. I don't think she would have received the same treatment by the doctors and get refused service if she was a white woman or a white woman with money. But that's just my opinion. Even today, there are studies and reports that Black women do not receive the same standard of care and or are less likely to be believed by their doctors. For example, here's a direct quote from a Today.com article, which is entitled, "You Are Not Listening to Me, a Black Woman on Pain and Implicit Bias in Medicine." And this was written by Vidya Rao. And this is a direct quote. A 2016 study found that nearly half of first and second year medical students believe that Black people have thicker skin than white people and perceived Black people as experiencing less pain than white people, which is an idea born from 19th century experiments that were conducted by a physician named Thomas Hamilton. He was a wealthy plantation owner who regularly tortured enslaved Black man named John Brown, creating blisters all over his body in an effort to prove that Black skin went deeper than white skin. A 2019 study published in the American Journal of Emergency Medicine analyzed data from 14 previously published studies on pain management and found that Black patients were 40% less likely to receive medication for acute pain compared to white patients, and 34% less likely to be prescribed opioids, end quote. So not only that, but the U.S. has one of the highest maternal death rates, which is death during pregnancy up through the first year postpartum, and it's even higher for Black women across all socioeconomic backgrounds. Again, this could be like a whole other episode, but I just wanted to share some of this just to kind of show how some things have changed and some things haven't changed since the time of Henrietta Lacks. And this is according to a report released earlier this year by the Journal of the American Medical Association, which looked at maternal death rates from 1999 to 2019. But to bring it back to Henrietta's time, she was living in what is referred to as a Jim Crow South, which we can do more episodes about specifically. But basically, this is a time of segregation, and states had many laws in place that made it easy to incarcerate Black people for the smallest of things. So this was the reality that Henrietta and her family were living in the 1950s Maryland. And it is why Henrietta went to Johns Hopkins Public Ward, because it was one of the few places that would actually accept Black patients. Part 3, scientific breakthroughs and achievements with HeLa cells. The Tuskegee University played a big role in producing HeLa cells, and by the summer of 1955, they were producing roughly 20,000 tube cultures a week, and they had already shipped out approximately 600,000 cultures of HeLa cells. The year before, in 1954, a company called Microbiological Associates Incorporated copied their production methods and created a huge cell culture factory that was, like a weird fact, a converted Fritos factory in order to mass produce HeLa cells and ship them around the world. And this, ladies and gentlemen, kicked off the multi-billion-dollar industry of biomedical specimens production and selling. So I just wanted to point out how great of an impact Henrietta cells had on the biomedical world. I mean, she basically helped start it. So there's this really cool website from the National Institute of Health's Office of Science Policy called Significant Research Advances Enabled by HeLa Cells. And I will put the link for that in the show notes. It's basically a database of all the published articles whose researchers have used HeLa cells. And then it has different search functions, and you can search by decade or by the different fields. And then it also has a timeline with all the major highlights. And then it has all the articles for that as well, if you want to take a deep dive on any specific event. I'd highly encourage you to check it out. And here's a couple of examples of how Henrietta cells have been used over the decades in scientific research and breakthroughs. So as I mentioned in the intro, HeLa cells were instrumental in the development of the polio vaccine in 1953. Researchers were able to grow large amounts of the polio virus using the HeLa cells, which allowed them to better understand how the virus infects cells and cause disease. And then in 2008, a researcher named Dr. Zur demonstrated that certain types of viruses can cause cancer using human papillomavirus infected HeLa cells. This was one of the first studies to definitively show that viruses can cause certain types of cancer. And his discovery also leads to the development of a vaccine against cervical cancer, which is the second most common cancer in women. Part 4. So what has and hasn't changed with this kind of area of patient consent and bodily specimen ownership? So I don't want to get too much into this again because this is a huge topic, but I did want to highlight that there have been some laws put into place to protect patients and give guidelines as to how and when human specimens can be used, which have been enacted since Henrietta Lacks's time. So one of the main laws in the United States is called the Common Rule, which defines what research involving human subjects is and also defines the requirements for institutional review board review and informed consent for human subjects research. So I'm going to read a paragraph straight from the article titled Use of Human Specimens in Research, the Evolving United States Regulatory, Policy, and Scientific Landscape by Mariana J. Bledsoe and William E. Grizzle. Yes, and I just read these really super fun, interesting articles, because someone has to do it. All right, quote, the common rule would apply when specimens or associated information are obtained for research from a living individual through intervention or interaction with the individual, such as a blood draw or cheek swab, or when residual specimens taken during the course of routine care are collected prospectively for research purposes. It would also apply when identifiable specimens are used for research. So that's when the identity of a subject is or may readily be ascertained by the investigator or associated with the specimens. Furthermore, in order for research involving human specimens to be considered human subjects research under the common rule, the individuals must be living. Thus, according to the common rule, as currently written, research involving material from deceased individuals, i.e., autopsy material, or the use of specimens that are completely anonymous, so a link to the subject identity does not exist, this would not be subject to the common rule, although state and local regulations and policies may apply. Under certain circumstances, research using coded specimens, that is, specimens for which identifying information has been replaced with a code, may not be considered human subjects research if certain conditions have been met. End quote. So what does that mean? So basically, even though there are laws establishing guidelines around consent and how researchers can use human specimens, there are still quite a number of loopholes that would allow researchers to use specimens without direct consent. And from what the paragraph I just read, that would be like autopsy material or basically any specimens that can be coded or made to be anonymous. So I feel like that's pretty easy to do in this day and age. So essentially, there are many ways that researchers can use your specimens without you explicitly saying that they can use it. And in the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, the author Rebecca Skloot goes into some examples of how people have still been taken advantage of by researchers who have used their specimens for undisclosed purposes and to make money. So this part of the book made me pretty irritated. And I'm someone who works in the biotechnology field as a researcher. And when I read this part of the book, I was actually very surprised and taken aback, to be quite honest. It's pretty crazy. So here we go. Here's a couple examples. In 1976, a man named John Moore developed hairy cell leukemia, which is very rare and very deadly. He was referred to a doctor at UCLA named David Gold, who told John the only option was to remove his spleen. So John agreed to the surgery and signed paperwork saying the hospital could, quote, dispose of any severed tissue or member by cremation, end quote. The surgery was successful, and John went about his life in Washington State. Dr. Gold asked John to fly down to LA for follow-up appointments where he collected blood, bone marrow, and semen. So this happened for years until John got a little suspicious and was like, why do you need all of my bodily specimens so often? And he actually stopped signing the consent forms, which stated he and any heirs would agree to the voluntarily grant UC all rights to his cell line or any product that might be developed from his specimens. So this consent form is interesting because this same year, Rolling Stone published an article about Henrietta Lacks and how her cell line was being profited off of. So it turns out it kind of sounds like Dr. Gold was trying to get ahead of this by having John sign something saying like, if we ever make something profitable off of your specimens, you already agreed to it. Because it turns out Dr. Gold had entered agreements with a biotech company because he had created and patented a cell line out of John's cells for stock options and more than $3.5 million to commercially develop this cell line. And the market value of this cell line at that time was $3 billion. It's crazy. And this whole time, John has no idea what Dr. Gold's doing. And so it turns out John had rare proteins that could be used to treat infections and cancer. And his blood also had a rare virus called HTLV, which is a cousin of the HIV. So researchers thought that they could actually use this to create an HIV vaccine. So then John kind of figures this out. And in 1984, he sues Dr. Gold and UCLA for deceiving him and using his body in research without consent. And he also claimed property rights over his tissues and said that Dr. Gold had stolen them. And he was the first person to ever make this claim about his own tissues and sue for profits and damages. This was also the first time the general public realized that money could be made off of bodily specimens. So the judge threw out John's case and ironically used HeLa cells and the fact that no one had ever sued over them as precedent and somehow proved that people don't care how their specimens are used once they're taken out of their bodies. The judge thought John was being unreasonable in his objections, which is just crazy. John appealed this, and the appeals court ruled in his favor, but then Dr. Gold appealed that ruling and won his appeal. So this works its way all the way up to the California Supreme Court 7 years after John's original court case, and the Supreme Court states, when tissues are removed from your body with or without consent, any claim you might have had to owning them vanishes. When you leave the hospital or doctor's office, you are abandoning the tissues as waste, and anyone can take your garbage and sell it. And that has been the precedent since. So, the question of whether you own your specimens or not, California Supreme Court has set the precedent that you do not, and that anyone can make money off of them, and you can't sue them because it is not yours anymore. So the ruling also stated that if they had ruled in John's favor, it might, quote, destroy the economic incentive to conduct important medical research, end quote, and that giving patients property rights to their tissues might, quote, hinder research by restricting access to the necessary raw materials, end quote, and create a field where, quote, with every cell sample, a researcher purchases a ticket in a litigation lottery, end quote. Sorry, this is making me upset. After the ruling, the dean of Stanford University School of Medicine was quoted as saying that as long as researchers disclose their financial interests, patients shouldn't object because, quote, if you did, I guess you could sit there with your ruptured appendix and negotiate, end quote. So yeah, basically, we don't want to hinder capitalism. And, basically, everyone can, or like researchers can have the right to make money off of your body, but you can't because they've taken the sample from you. That's cool. Cool. This is just crazy because biotech and pharmaceutical companies already make so much money, and then to basically say, and where we get that from, the humans that make this research possible don't deserve or have rights to any of this money, which I think is insane. And not to mention in the US, just how much we have to shell out for basic health care, basic health insurance, medicines. It's insane that we're the ones that are the money-grabbing people when in reality, it's these big biotech companies that are screwing us over. Anyway, and like, just for an example, in the US, a surgery could cost someone, even with good insurance, thousands of dollars, and it could put someone without insurance into debt for the rest of their lives, while the hospital could then go and take that person's tissue sample and end up making millions of dollars off of it, which is just insane to me. God bless America, you know what I mean? And just by the way, medical debt is roughly $88 billion in the United States, and 43% of U.S. citizens have or have had some sort of medical debt. But again, I digress a bit. That's another episode. Anyway, part 5. So what happened to Henrietta's family? So shortly after Dr. Gay was able to prove that HeLa cells were, in fact, immortal, researchers asked to get blood from Henrietta's husband and children. And the person in charge of this tried explaining it to Mr. Lax, but he had only a middle school education, and the researcher was using a lot of like medical and science jargon and wasn't overall a great communicator of what the research project was and why they wanted the family's blood. So therefore, many of the family members actually thought that they all had the same cancer as Henrietta, and they were really confused by Henrietta's cells being, quote, alive. And in fact, Henrietta's family didn't even know what HeLa cells were or how they were being used until 25 years after they were first grown. When the news first came out about HeLa cells, Dr. Gay had actually used a fake name of Helen Lanes. So even at that time, Henrietta's family would have no idea that these were her cells. And for decades after the first discovery of the immortality of Henrietta's cells, without the family's consent or consultation, doctors and scientists repeatedly used Henrietta's name publicly, gave out her medical records to the media, and more recently, her genome was published online. But that was shortly removed after public outcry. Also more recently, the Lax family had reached an agreement with the U.S. National Institutes of Health, which is the NIH, to approve the release of one of HeLa's cell line's genome, which is basically like the DNA sequence of a person. I don't know if you guys are familiar with like the 1,000 Genomes Project, but it's basically very personal information. And with today's like genomic boom, you can kind of glean a lot of information just with public resources. So, you know, there's a lot of ethics involved behind just releasing someone's genome publicly without their consent. And Henrietta's family has never received any compensation for the use of her cells, even though, like I was saying, many biotech companies make so much money off of them. For example, in doing this research, I searched for HeLa cells on Thermo Fisher's website, which is a very big biotech company. And there was a certain type of HeLa cell line that had a certain protein expression in it. So it was like a HeLa cell line that Thermo had made to include this protein expression. And it sells for $2,240 for 1 milliliter. Sorry, US folks. That is the metric system, but that's not a lot of liquid. It's just a small tube. But ironically enough, I was finishing up the research for this in like late August, early September of this year. I saw a news article that was saying Henrietta Lax's family settled with who else? Thermo Fisher in a closed-door settlement in August of this year. So they didn't release very many details about what the terms of the settlement actually were, because those are confidential. But her family had filed the lawsuit in 2021 and argued that Thermo Fisher, quote, unjustly, end quote, profited off of HeLa cells long after it was known who she was and who her family were. So yeah, I think, and it's also so new, we'll see, but this could be very good for people, and kind of change the tide for profiting off of people's specimens without their knowledge or consent. And from all the things that Henrietta's family has gone through, I'm very happy that Thermo, through their closed door settlement, I think are kind of saying, hey, yeah, this was not okay. Although, I mean, they're still making tons of money off of her cells every year. But I didn't want to end, well, I mean, I guess that's a positive note for Henrietta's family. And I also wanted to wrap up this episode with some more positive things that have come out of this tragic story. And some of that is with how Johns Hopkins is honoring Henrietta Lacks. This is from their website. So they have 2 Henrietta Lacks symposiums. One is one that brings together researchers and the community to discuss ethics in medical research and how they can effectively work together, which I think is super important, especially as biotechnology advances. The question around the ethics of it are going to be even more important. And then the second symposium is an annual Henrietta Lacks High School Symposium, which brings Baltimore City youth to Johns Hopkins to spend a day learning about biomedical research and bioethics. They also have a Henrietta Lacks East Baltimore Health Sciences Scholarship, which, quote, provides a graduate of Paul Laurence Dunbar High School with a college scholarship of up to $10,000 per year for 4 years to pursue a career in science. And then they have the Henrietta Lacks Memorial Award, which the Johns Hopkins Urban Health Institute offers $15,000 to highlight the importance of community university collaborations and recognize, support, and promote exceptional programs developed jointly by university members and local community groups. So, just some positive things that have come out from this. So to wrap this up, I just wanted to say that even though Henrietta Lacks and her family were wronged by all those who profited off of Henrietta cells, the technological advancements, therapies, vaccines, etc., that came from and through working with her cells is something that the family is very proud of. And in that way, Henrietta's legacy will live on forever. And hopefully her story continues to be told, because I feel like a lot of people might work with HeLa cells on a day-to-day basis, but don't know who she was and where those cells come from, which as someone who is in the biotech world, I think is very important. That, you know, science, biotechnology, it's often thought of in abstract theories and logical, methodical ways. But at the end of the day, behind the science are human beings, and that shouldn't be forgotten by those who work in the field and also the general public. And I just want to end this episode with a quote from Henrietta's son, Lawrence Lacks Sr. Quote, "We are proud of all the good that Henrietta has done for the world. While Henrietta Lacks's HeLa cells were taken without her knowledge or consent, her contribution has had a significant and wide-reaching scientific impact. The Henrietta Lacks Enhancing Cancer Research Act, which requires the federal government to publish a report on government-funded cancer research trials, honors and builds on my mother's legacy by helping to ensure communities of color have more equitable access to advances in cancer treatment. In life, she was my loving mother, and in death, she unknowingly became the mother of modern medicine. Her contributions, once hidden, are now being rightfully honored for their global impact. And as the world celebrates Henrietta Lacks's 100th birthday, it is only fitting that this law builds upon her legacy by ensuring equitable access to advances in cancer treatment for all people. And with that, I want to thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And until next week, keep learning out loud and chasing curiosity. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review the podcast on whatever platform you listen on. And be sure to follow the podcast on Instagram at learningoutloudpod. If you have a topic you'd like for me to cover or have a comment about the episode, feel free to leave a voice message at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/LOLpod/message. And the links will be in the episode description.